I am 73 years old, and I have lived alone in the frozen wilderness of Montana for nearly half my life. In all those years, I have heard wolves circle my cabin, watched mountain lions pass through my yard, and survived storms strong enough to erase entire roads overnight. But never, not once, had something knocked on my door, until the night it finally happened. It was the end of winter, the kind of bitter night when the wind sounds almost human, and the forest goes unnaturally quiet. Then came 3 heavy knocks, slow, deliberate, impossible to mistake for the wind. When I opened the door, my heart nearly stopped. Standing on my porch was a shivering baby elephant, and behind it, a massive, pregnant black panther, staring straight at me. She wasn't growling, she wasn't hunting, she was asking for help. But what I discovered just hours later would make me realize one terrifying truth. They weren't running from the cold, they were running from something far more dangerous. Before this story continues, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? And if you believe you would have opened that door, hit subscribe, because what happened that night proved that sometimes the wild doesn't come to harm us. Sometimes it comes to trust us. The first knock came just after sunset, at that strange hour when winter loosens its grip but refuses to fully let go. Up here in northern Montana, the end of the season has its own personality. The snow along the tree line turns heavy and wet. The roof drips steadily like a slow clock, and the wind carries the scent of thawing earth beneath months of silence. I had just finished stacking the last of my firewood near the stone hearth, my old hands stiff from the cold despite the gloves, when the sound echoed through the cabin again. It was not loud, but it was deliberate. 3 solid knocks. Not the nervous tapping of a loose branch, not the hollow scrape of ice sliding from the roof. I stood still, listening. At 73, you learn the language of the wilderness, whether you want to or not. Every creak means something. Every silence means more. And this was wrong. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. No one comes this far into the Absaroka wilderness without a reason. And in late winter, reasons are rarely good. My nearest neighbor lived 12 miles down a logging road that the snow still hadn't fully released, and deliveries stopped weeks ago. I hadn't expected company, human or otherwise, and yet the knock came again, slower this time, heavier, as though whatever stood outside had grown impatient. The fire popped behind me, sending a brief shower of sparks against the iron grate, and I became suddenly aware of how alone I truly was. Out here, if something goes wrong, the forest keeps its secrets. I pulled on my coat, more out of instinct than necessity, and reached for the lantern hanging beside the door. The bulb above the porch had burned out days ago, and I hadn't bothered replacing it. The moon usually gave me enough light. Tonight, however, a thin veil of clouds blurred the sky, turning the world into a dim watercolor of whites and shadows. The wood floor creaked beneath my boots as I stepped forward. Another knock followed, not frantic, not aggressive, just certain, intentional. My hand hovered over the handle longer than I care to admit. In 4 decades of living beside this forest, I had opened this door to wounded elk, stray dogs, even once to a half-frozen hiker who swore he'd followed the wrong ridge for 2 days. But something in my chest told me this would not be like those times. When I finally pulled the door inward, the cold slipped inside first, sharp enough to steal the breath from my lungs. For a second I saw nothing, only the pale stretch of my porch dusted with melting snow. Then the lantern light lowered, and my mind struggled to make sense of the shape standing directly before me. A baby elephant. Even now, saying the words feels unreal. The animal stood no taller than my chest, its small body trembling so violently that its ears fluttered with each shiver. A thin layer of frost clung to the fine hairs along its back, sparkling faintly in the lantern glow. Its trunk lifted toward me, hesitant, almost searching, and a low sound escaped it. Not quite a cry, not quite a call, just a plea. My first irrational thought was that I had finally lost the sturdy grip on reality I'd prided myself on keeping all these years. Montana is bear country, wolf country, mountain lion country. But elephants belong to another hemisphere, another world entirely. Yet there it stood, leaving shallow, round impressions in the slush on my porch, as if it had every right to be there. And then I saw her, at the edge of the lantern's reach, where the weak light dissolved into darkness. Two eyes reflected back at me, steady, unblinking, ancient. The shape detached itself from the shadows with a fluid grace that made the hair along my arms rise despite the cold. A black panther stepped forward without a sound, her paws so deliberate they barely disturbed the thin crust of snow. She was enormous, far larger than any cougar I had ever glimpsed in these mountains, her coat swallowing the light until she seemed carved from the night itself. But what held my gaze was not her size, nor even the quiet power rolling beneath her shoulders. It was her belly, rounded, heavy, swaying slightly as she moved. She was pregnant, close to term, if my old ranch instincts meant anything anymore. Every story I had ever heard about predators screamed through my mind at once. Close the door. Do not turn your back. Do not run. Yet the panther did none of the things a hunter should do. She did not crouch, did not bare her teeth. Instead, she lowered her great head and gently nudged the baby elephant forward, guiding it toward the narrow strip of dry wood near my threshold. The little creature stumbled once, then leaned subtly toward the warmth spilling from inside my cabin. I realized then that I had stopped breathing. The three of us remained frozen in that fragile triangle, man, prey, predator, bound together by something I could not yet understand. The forest behind them was unnaturally quiet. No owl calls, no distant crack of branches. Even the wind seemed to hold itself back, as though the wilderness were watching to see what I would do next. "Where is your mother?" I heard myself whisper. Though I could not have said which animal I meant, the elephant let out a faint rumble, shifting its weight. The panther's gaze never left my face. There was intelligence in those eyes, not the simple calculation of hunger, but something deeper, something measuring, waiting. That was when a thought settled into my chest with unexpected certainty. She wasn't here to hunt. She was here because she had nowhere else to go. A slow drip fell from the roof, striking the porch between us with a hollow tick. The panther blinked once, then, with astonishing care, sank down onto her haunches. Snow compressed beneath her weight. The movement seemed less like surrender and more like exhaustion, finally claiming its due. Up close, I could see the faint rise and fall of her flanks, quicker than they should have been. Traveling this late in winter, and in her condition, meant desperation of a kind the wild rarely forgives. My heart pounded hard enough that I felt it in my throat. Logic insisted this was madness. One wrong movement, one misunderstood gesture, and the story of Elias Carter would end as nothing more than a cautionary tale told by rangers over bitter coffee. Yet another feeling pressed quietly against that fear. An older instinct, perhaps, the same one that makes you reach out when you see something small and defenseless trembling in the cold. The baby elephant stretched its trunk across the threshold, and warm air curled around it. Its eyes fluttered halfway closed. Behind it, the panther watched me, not with threat, but with expectation. In all my years beside this forest, I had believed I understood the rules. Predators remain in the dark, and men survive by keeping their distance from it. But as I stood there with the winter air biting at my back and two impossible visitors waiting on my porch, one truth settled over me with quiet finality. Predators do not knock on doors. So why was she asking me to open mine? For several long seconds, none of us moved. The lantern trembled slightly in my grip, casting thin, wavering shadows across the porch, but the panther's eyes remained steady, locked onto mine with a focus that felt less like a threat and more like a question. I had seen predators before. Out here, that was unavoidable. Usually there is a tension in them, a coiled readiness, as if violence is always only a heartbeat away. But this animal carried something else entirely: fatigue, strain, and beneath it, a quiet urgency I could almost feel pressing against the cold air between us. The baby elephant shifted again, its legs wobbling from exhaustion. Up close I could see the faint outline of its ribs beneath the wrinkled grey skin. Whatever journey had brought it here had been far too long for something so young. A soft sound slipped from its throat, not loud, but fragile enough that it tightened something deep inside my chest. Without thinking, I stepped back from the doorway. It was an invitation. Warm air drifted outward, curling around them like an invisible hand. The elephant noticed first. It lifted its trunk, testing the heat, then took one uncertain step forward. I held my breath, half expecting the panther to surge in after it, instincts finally overriding whatever strange truce held this moment together. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, though her muscles tensed as the little one crossed the threshold. Snow melted instantly beneath the elephant's feet, forming small dark circles on the wooden floor. It stopped just inside, looking around with wide, uncertain eyes. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud, uneven, but still the panther did not move. She only watched. "You can come in," I murmured before I realized I was speaking aloud. For the first time, her gaze shifted, not away but downward toward her swollen belly. The movement was subtle, yet it told me everything I needed to know. Traveling this far, this late in winter, she wasn't simply searching for food. She was searching for somewhere safe to give birth. The thought landed heavily on me. Predators do not abandon their territory without cause. Something had driven her out of the forest, something powerful enough to make a creature like this risk approaching a human shelter. After a moment's hesitation, the panther rose and stepped forward. Each paw touched the porch with careful precision, as though she understood the fragile agreement forming between us. When she finally crossed into the cabin, the space seemed to shrink around her. Up close, I could see faint scars along her shoulder and a dullness in her coat where ice had once clung. Her breathing was shallow, controlled, but strained. She was running out of strength. I nudged another log into the fire, and sparks leapt upward, filling the room with a deeper warmth. The elephant shuffled closer to the hearth almost immediately, letting out a low rumble that sounded suspiciously like relief. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe the danger had passed. Then the panther turned her head toward the window. Her ears angled forward. Her body stiffened. I followed her gaze into the fading blue of evening, but at first I saw nothing. Only the skeletal outlines of pines and the slow drift of melting snow. And then I noticed it. The forest had gone completely silent. No wind through the branches, no distant animal calls, not even the restless chatter of nightbirds preparing to wake. Just a heavy, unnatural stillness. The panther released a low sound, not a growl, but a warning that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Something had followed them out of the wilderness. And suddenly I understood with chilling clarity. They had not come here by chance. They had come here because whatever was out there frightened even a creature the forest itself feared. I have lived beside the wilderness long enough to understand one simple truth. Silence in the forest is never empty. It is always caused by something. Usually a passing predator, sometimes a storm rolling in before the clouds even gather. And on rare occasions, something far worse. I stood very still near the fire, watching the panther as her body transformed before my eyes. Only minutes ago she had looked exhausted, nearly defeated by whatever miles lay behind her. Now, every muscle along her spine had tightened, her head angled slightly toward the dark window, ears forward, listening with a precision no human could ever match. The baby elephant sensed it too, Animals always do. The little one stopped shifting near the hearth and turned toward the same window, its trunk lifting into the air as it tested the scent drifting through the faint cracks in the cabin walls. A soft rumble built inside its chest, not loud but uneasy. Fear has a language that crosses species, and suddenly my small cabin felt less like a shelter and more like the fragile center of a widening storm. I moved closer to the glass, careful not to make any sudden motions. Outside, dusk had nearly surrendered to night, leaving only a dim wash of blue across the snow. The tree line stood motionless, tall pines frozen like silent witnesses. For several seconds, I saw nothing unusual, and then a flicker of movement caught my eye far beyond the clearing. A light, faint, artificial. My stomach tightened. No one drives this deep into the Absaroka range in late winter unless they know exactly where they're going. Tourists don't come until summer, and the nearest ranger station sits over 30 miles south. Yet there it was again, a narrow beam weaving slowly between the trees before disappearing behind a ridge. The panther released another low warning. "You see it too," I whispered. She did not look at me, but somehow I felt acknowledged. A memory surfaced then, unwelcome and heavy. 3 weeks earlier, while checking my trap lines, I had heard helicopters circling farther north, low, methodical passes that rattled the treetops. At the time, I assumed it was a survey crew or some wildlife count the state forgot to mention. But helicopters in winter rarely mean anything good for the animals below. Too much snow, too little cover. Now, watching that distant light move with deliberate patience, a colder possibility formed in my mind. Poachers. The word settled into my chest like ice. My gaze drifted downward, toward the faint impression still visible on my porch, the wide, circular tracks of the elephant preserved in slush. Tracks that had not begun here, but stretched back into the forest. Back toward whatever horror had pushed a pregnant panther to trust a human cabin. "I need to see where you came from," I muttered, more to myself than to them. The panther's head snapped toward me instantly, her eyes sharpening. For a moment we held each other's stare, and I understood the message as clearly as if she had spoken it. "Don't go." But stubbornness has always been one of my less admirable traits. I pulled on my heavier coat, grabbed the rifle resting above the mantel, not out of aggression, but caution, and stepped onto the porch. The cold bit harder now, night tightening its grip as the temperature dropped. My boots sank slightly into the wet snow, and I followed the trail leading away from the cabin. It did not take long. Perhaps 50 yards beyond the tree line, the forest began to tell its story. Broken branches hung low, bark freshly stripped. Deep gouges scarred the earth where something enormous had struggled. Then I saw the drag marks, long, uneven paths cutting through the snow before vanishing beneath a thin crust of ice. Another step forward and the metallic scent reached me. Blood, frozen into dark sheets across the white ground. My throat went dry as the pattern assembled itself with terrible clarity. Multiple shots had been fired here. The evidence lay everywhere once I knew how to look. The herd had been trapped, funneled between ridges with nowhere to run. Adults first, most likely. Tusks fetch a price that makes monsters out of ordinary men. I closed my eyes briefly, but the images came anyway. Thunder of rifles, panicked cries swallowed by winter air, bodies collapsing into the snow. And somehow, one baby survived. A faint sound behind me made me turn. The panther stood at the edge of the trees, having followed despite her condition. Moonlight traced the curve of her swollen belly, her breath forming small clouds that drifted upward and vanished. She did not approach the blood. She only watched me, and in her gaze I saw something that reached far beyond instinct. Not hunger, not rage, recognition. She had found the orphan first, and instead of claiming it as prey, she had chosen to guard it. The realization settled slowly but completely. The most feared hunter in these mountains had walked away from an easy kill, and then crossed miles of winter wilderness to keep that small life breathing. A distant engine growled softly through the trees. I turned toward the sound, dread creeping along my spine. Those men, they weren't finished. And if they discovered witnesses, human or animal, they would not leave loose ends behind. For the first time since opening my door, true fear took hold of me. Not the sharp, fleeting kind that fades once danger passes, but the heavy certainty that something was already moving toward us through the dark. As I started back toward the cabin, one thought repeated itself with every step. They hadn't just escaped the forest, they were being hunted out of it. By the time I reached the cabin, the last light had drained completely from the sky, leaving the world wrapped in that deep northern darkness that always feels thicker at the end of winter. The kind of darkness that absorbs sound and bends distance until the forest seems far closer than it truly is. I shut the door firmly behind me, sliding the iron latch into place, though the gesture felt more symbolic than protective. If the men I suspected were truly out there, armed, organized, and already guilty of slaughter, a wooden cabin would not slow them for long. Still, old habits die hard. You secure what little shelter you have and prepare to endure. The baby elephant lifted its head the moment I stepped inside, a low rumble escaping it, as if confirming I had returned. It had settled awkwardly near the hearth, legs folded beneath its small body, steam rising faintly from its damp skin as the fire chased the cold away. Up close, it looked even younger than I first thought, its eyes too large for its face, its movements unsure, as though the world had changed faster than it could understand. A smear of dried blood marked one side of its leg, not deep enough to cripple, but enough to tell me it had not escaped the chaos untouched. The panther remained near the door. She had not lain down again. Instead, she stood angled toward the windows, her tail low, ears constantly shifting to capture sounds beyond human range. Every few seconds, her gaze flicked toward the elephant, checking, counting, ensuring it was still there. I had spent enough years observing wildlife to recognize the pattern. This was not casual tolerance. This was guardianship. "You stayed with it," I said quietly, more certain of it now than ever. Her eyes met mine briefly, and in them I saw neither wild panic nor the glassy edge of starvation, only a steady resolve. I added another log to the fire, forcing myself to focus on small, practical tasks while my thoughts churned. Outside, the temperature was falling again, one final bite from winter before spring could push through. A storm was coming. I could smell it in the air earlier, that faint metallic sharpness that always precedes mountain weather. If the poachers were still moving through the forest, the snow might slow them, but it would trap us just as easily. Then the panther's body stiffened, not gradually, instantly. Her head snapped toward the far ridge beyond the cabin, and a sound rolled through the night a second later, faint but unmistakable. An engine, low, idling, too controlled to be someone lost. The elephant struggled upright, sensing the shift in the air, and let out a nervous cry that seemed far too loud for my liking. I moved toward the lantern and dimmed it until the room fell into a softer glow. Instinct whispered the same warning it always had. Do not advertise your position in the wild. The engine noise faded, then returned, closer this time, accompanied by the crunch of tires forcing their way over old snowpack. "They're tracking," I muttered, my mouth suddenly dry. My gaze dropped to the floor, to the widening puddles where the elephant's melted footprints had gathered. Outside, those tracks would be even clearer, a perfect trail leading straight to my door. For a moment, fear pressed hard against my ribs. I was an old man, with a rifle I prayed I wouldn't have to use, sheltering two animals the world would consider impossible guests. Sensible men would have driven away hours ago, pretended they had seen nothing. But as the elephant leaned subtly toward the panther, and the panther shifted closer in silent reassurance, despite the strain evident in her breathing, something settled inside me with unexpected calm. They had crossed miles of frozen wilderness to reach this cabin. They had chosen it, chosen me. Another gust carried the distant murmur of voices through the trees, too far to distinguish words, but close enough to erase any remaining doubt. The hunters had found the trail, and as I looked at the swollen curve of the panther's belly, rising and falling a little faster now, a heavier realization took hold. She had not come here simply to survive the night. She had come here because she was running out of time. Whatever happened next would happen before morning. I'm a 73-year-old man with a weathered face and stiff hands, wearing a heavy winter coat. The storm arrived faster than I expected. In the mountains, weather does not politely announce itself. It advances like an army. One moment the forest stood tense but visible beneath a thin wash of moonlight, and the next, wind tore down through the ridges with a force that rattled the cabin walls. Snow followed almost immediately, thick and slanted, swallowing the world beyond my windows until the trees themselves faded into pale ghosts. Under different circumstances, I might have welcomed it. Late winter storms often convince trouble to turn back. But as the faint hum of that engine drifted once more through the rising wind, I understood the cruel truth. This storm would hide them just as well as it hid us. Inside, the air had grown heavy with anticipation. The baby elephant paced in small, restless circles near the hearth, its soft cries trembling through the room whenever the wind slammed against the roof. Each sound seemed to tighten the panther further. She had moved away from the door now, positioning herself squarely between the elephant and the windows, her massive frame low and ready, despite the unmistakable fatigue dragging at her limbs. Up close, I could see the subtle tremors running along her sides. Labor was nearing. Any fool could recognize it. Her time was no longer measured in days. Another sound cut through the storm. A door slamming. Muffled voices, closer than before. I extinguished the lantern completely, leaving only the fire's dim pulse to paint the cabin in shifting amber shadows. Darkness sharpened every noise, the ticking of cooling metal, the elephant's uneven breathing, the slow scrape of the panther adjusting her weight. My rifle rested across my palms as I stepped nearer to the window, careful to remain hidden behind the wall. Then I saw it. A narrow beam of light dragged across the clearing, jittering as someone fought the wind. It swept past the woodpile, the frozen trough, and stopped briefly on the porch, right where the tracks ended. "Over here!" a voice shouted faintly through the storm. My stomach dropped. Boots crunched outside, deliberate and unhurried. These were not lost travelers seeking shelter. There was confidence in those steps. The ugly confidence of men who believed the wilderness belonged to whoever carried the bigger weapon. I counted at least 2 shapes moving beyond the blur of snow. Maybe 3. Behind me, the elephant froze. The panther did not. She rose without sound, placing herself directly between the door and the small life she guarded. A low vibration rolled from her chest, so deep I felt it through the floorboards before I truly heard it. Not fear, a warning. The knob shifted, once, then again harder. "Cabin's warm," another voice called. "Someone's inside." For a fleeting second, instinct screamed at me to stay silent, to pretend no one was home. But the men already knew. The tracks had betrayed us all. The panther stepped forward. Her silhouette merged with the darkness near the entrance, eyes reflecting faint firelight like 2 steady embers. There was no hesitation in her now, no trace of the exhaustion that had followed her to my porch. Whatever strength remained in her battered body had gathered into this single moment. The knob twisted sharply. Locked. A pause followed, the quiet, dangerous kind. Then the unmistakable metallic click of a rifle being chambered echoed through the storm. And as the baby elephant pressed trembling against the back of my legs, I realized with chilling clarity, those men hadn't just come to reclaim what they lost in the forest. They had come to erase every witness, human included. Time slowed in the way it often does when danger finally steps out of the shadows and shows its face. The wind battered the cabin so violently now that it almost masked the smaller sounds, the scrape of a boot against the porch, the muted clink of metal brushing wood, the steady breath I forced myself to control. At 73, you come to understand exactly how fragile a human body is. Bones do not mend quickly, reflexes dull, and yet the instinct to protect what stands behind you does not weaken with age. If anything, it hardens. The door shuddered under a sudden impact, once, twice. Wood splintered faintly near the latch. The baby elephant let out a sharp cry and pressed closer into the back of my legs, its warmth startling through the heavy denim. Without thinking, my free hand moved behind me until my fingers found the rough edge of its ear. A silent reassurance, perhaps meant more for me than for it. Then the panther growled. It was not loud, but it was enormous. The sound filled the cabin like distant thunder rolling through a canyon, low enough to vibrate the ribs, yet controlled with terrifying precision. I had heard mountain lions scream before, wild, feral sounds meant to paralyze prey, but this was different. This was deliberate, a message sent through wood and storm alike. There was a pause outside. One of the men muttered something I couldn't catch. Another strike hit the door, harder this time, the hinges whining in protest. "Last chance!" a voice shouted through the wind. "Open it!" The panther took a single step forward. Firelight slid across her black coat, revealing the full breadth of her body, the powerful shoulders, the deep chest, the heavy curve of her swollen belly that swayed slightly as she shifted her weight. Even now, even with birth so close, she placed herself between danger and the smaller life behind her. A third blow cracked the frame. Cold air knifed through the widening seam. I lifted the rifle, though my hands knew what my heart refused to admit. If shooting started, none of us would walk away untouched. Violence inside a space this small never ends cleanly. Then it happened. The latch tore loose with a dry snap and the door lurched inward several inches before slamming against the chain I'd secured earlier. Snow spiraled through the gap, scattering across the floor in frantic white streaks. And in that instant, the panther roared. Not the restrained warning from before, but a full, primal detonation that seemed far too large for any single creature. It burst from her chest with such force that the chain rattled violently against the wood. I saw the men recoil through the narrow opening, just shadows stumbling backward. And for the briefest heartbeat, the wilderness itself felt as though it had surged forward to stand with us. "Jesus! What is that?" one of them shouted. The panther did not wait. With a speed that defied her condition, she slammed her weight against the damaged door. The chain ripped free from the frame, screws tearing loose as if the wood were paper. The door flew open under the combined force of wind and muscle, and she exploded into the storm. What followed was chaos shaped in fragments, a flashlight spinning wildly through the snow, a rifle dropping, a man cursing as something heavy collided with him. I did not see the panther clearly. She moved too fast, a living shadow swallowed by the blizzard. But I heard it, the snarl, the desperate shouts, boots losing traction on ice. A shot cracked, then another. My heart stopped. But the panther did not retreat. Her roar rose again, closer now, layered with a fury so absolute it erased any illusion these men still held about their place in this forest. One figure broke first, scrambling toward the tree line, another crashing after him. Within seconds their engine roared to life, tires spinning uselessly before finally catching enough ground to drag them away into the white void. And then silence returned. Not the natural quiet of the wilderness, but the stunned hush that follows violence. I stepped onto the porch, rifle raised, breath clouding the air, and saw her standing at the edge of the clearing. Snow clung to her whiskers, her sides heaving as she fought for oxygen, yet she did not collapse. She simply watched the fading glow of the retreating vehicle until it vanished completely. Only then did her legs tremble. She turned toward the cabin, took one step, then another, before sinking heavily into the snow. When I reached her, the truth hit me all at once. This had cost her. Her breathing had grown shallow and uneven, and a tight ripple moved across her abdomen, once, then again. A rancher learns to recognize that rhythm without needing to be told. Labor had begun. She hadn't charged into that storm just to drive them away. She had done it knowing full well her body was already surrendering to birth. As the baby elephant shuffled nervously onto the porch behind me, releasing a soft, frightened rumble, I knelt beside the great predator and felt something shift deep in my chest, something heavier than fear. Tonight, she had not fought like a hunter defending territory. She had fought like a mother, buying time, and as another contraction tightened visibly along her flank, one sobering realization settled over me beneath the falling snow. Before this storm passed, new life was coming into a world already trying to destroy it. For a moment I simply knelt there beside her, the storm swirling around us as though the mountain itself had leaned down to witness what was unfolding on my porch. Snow gathered quickly along the panther's back, melting where it touched the heat of her body before freezing again in a thin, glassy sheen. Her breathing came in strained bursts now, each exhale trembling slightly, and when the next contraction rippled through her, I saw her claws press deep into the packed snow as if she were trying to anchor herself to the earth. Instinct told me she should not be out here. No creature should bring new life into a blizzard. Yet when I tried to move closer, she released a low warning, not hostile but firm. This was a boundary older than language. Birth, even in the wild, demanded space. "Easy, easy, girl," I murmured, my voice nearly lost to the wind. Behind me, the baby elephant shifted uncertainly on the threshold, letting out a soft, vibrating call that sounded heartbreakingly close to concern. It took a few hesitant steps forward until its small body hovered just behind the panther's shoulder, careful not to touch but unwilling to retreat inside. Watching them together, the orphan and the hunter, I felt that same quiet disbelief settle over me again. Nature is often painted as ruthless, but what I saw in that moment was something far more complicated. The elephant lowered its trunk gently, brushing it across the panther's back once before pulling away. She did not object. If anything, her tense muscles eased for half a second, as though she accepted the gesture. Another contraction seized her, this one stronger. Her head dropped, jaws parting slightly as a raw sound escaped her. Not quite a roar, not quite pain alone, but the kind of primal voice that reminds you all life enters this world through struggle. I forced myself into motion then, retreating inside only long enough to drag out 2 heavy wool blankets and an old canvas tarp I once used during carving season decades ago. My joints protested the cold as I spread them across the porch boards and the snow just beyond, creating what little barrier I could against the frozen ground. She watched me the entire time, eyes bright even through exhaustion, and when I finally stepped back, she shifted forward onto the makeshift bedding with slow, deliberate care. Time blurred after that. The storm softened gradually, its earlier violence settling into a steady curtain of falling snow. Minutes stretched, folded into one another until the world seemed reduced to 3 sounds. The wind, the fire crackling faintly behind me through the open doorway, and the labored rhythm of the panther's breath. I found myself speaking quietly without realizing it, the same low reassurances I had once offered frightened livestock long ago. Whether she understood the words did not matter. Calm travels in tone better than language. Then it happened. A deeper tremor coursed through her body, followed by a stillness so sudden it stole my own breath. She curled slightly, muscles tightening with a final, monumental effort, and the night seemed to hold itself suspended in that fragile space between pain and arrival. A small, dark shape slipped into the world. For a second, there was no movement at all, only the falling snow collecting gently along that new, fragile form. My heart lodged somewhere high in my throat. Then the panther bent forward with surprising urgency, clearing the membranes with swift, practiced motions, nudging the tiny body until a sound emerged. Thin, defiant, alive. The cub writhed weakly, its coat slick and darker than the storm itself, paws no larger than the heel of my hand. I had witnessed births before, but none that felt quite this improbable. Here, on the edge of a thawing wilderness, under the fading breath of winter, a creature so small had arrived against odds it would never comprehend. The baby elephant rumbled again, softer this time, and sank clumsily onto its knees nearby, as if understanding that something sacred had just taken place. Its great head lowered until it nearly touched the blankets, standing watch with an almost ceremonial stillness. The panther, meanwhile, gathered the cub close, her tongue moving in slow, determined strokes, despite the fatigue weighing down every motion. When she finally lifted her gaze to me, the fierceness I had seen earlier had transformed into something quieter but no less powerful. Trust, perhaps, or simple acknowledgement that for this one impossible night our lives had intersected for a reason neither of us could name. Dawn began as the faintest silver seam along the horizon. The storm clouds thinned, and a pale wash of early light spilled across the clearing, turning the snowfields into a muted ocean of white and blue. Steam rose gently from the panther's body now, the worst of the effort behind her, the cub tucked securely against her warmth. Exhaustion settled over the porch like a second blanket, but beneath it ran something steadier. Survival. I realized then that the forest sounded different, not silent as before, alive again. Somewhere far off, a bird tested the morning with a tentative call. Winter was loosening at last. As I stood there watching the three of them, the orphaned elephant, the battle-worn mother, and the fragile new life pressed against her, a quiet understanding rooted itself deep within me. All my years I had believed the wilderness was governed by tooth and hunger alone, yet what had arrived at my door was not savagery, it was faith. She had crossed miles of frozen terrain, fought off armed men, and endured the breaking limits of her own body for one simple chance, that her cub might enter the world somewhere safer than where it began. The cub shifted, releasing another tiny cry, and the panther curved instinctively around it, forming a living wall against the cold. And as the first true light of morning touched the porch, one thought settled over me with profound certainty. Last night, the wild had not come to my home as an enemy. It had come here to begin again. Morning did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a careful promise. The storm had spent its fury during the night, and what remained now was a fragile stillness stretched across the wilderness. Pale sunlight filtered through thinning clouds, scattering across the snow, until the entire clearing glowed with that quiet brilliance only late winter can produce. A brightness that does not yet carry warmth, but whispers that it is coming. I had not slept, not even for a minute, yet fatigue never truly reached me. Some moments are too large for the body to feel anything but awake. The panther still lay upon the blankets, her great frame curved protectively around the tiny cub pressed against her belly. In daylight, the newborn looked impossibly small, a living shadow rising and falling with each fragile breath. Every so often it searched blindly for warmth, and the mother responded instantly, drawing it closer without ever fully lifting her head. Exhaustion clung to her movements, but the alertness in her eyes had returned. She was listening again, measuring the forest now that the storm had peeled back its cover. The baby elephant had not wandered far. Sometime before dawn, it had settled beside the porch, folding its legs beneath itself with surprising gentleness for such a young creature. Snow had gathered along its back until the rising sun began to melt it into thin streams that traced the wrinkles of its skin. When I stepped outside, it reached its trunk toward me, brushing softly against my sleeve, not pleading this time, not frightened, just present. "You made it through the night," I said quietly, though the words were meant for all three of them. The forest answered with sound again, distant crows, the brittle crack of branches shedding ice, the faint dripping that signals the long surrender of winter. Life was returning, cautious but undeniable. And yet, beneath that renewal, I knew something else had changed. The tracks around my cabin told a story too large to hide, the deep tire ruts near the tree line, the scattered impressions from boots, the frozen stains I had discovered hours earlier. Those men might have fled the storm, but men like that rarely accept defeat. Sooner or later, they would understand what had escaped them. I was stacking fresh logs near the porch when the low hum reached my ears, different from the growl of poachers' engines, steadier, official somehow. It grew gradually until a green and white vehicle pushed through the thinning snow along the service trail, the emblem on its door catching the morning light. Wildlife officers. Two of them stepped out, their expressions shifting from routine alertness to open disbelief as their eyes moved from the elephant to the panther, to the impossibly small cub nestled against her side. "Sir," one of them said carefully, as if afraid a louder voice might fracture the scene, "we got a report of illegal aerial activity north of this range. Been tracking signs for days. But I have to ask, how long have they been here?" "Since last night," I answered. The younger officer exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "That panther traveled far. We've had helicopters chasing a poaching ring, pushing animals out of protected corridors. Happens more than folks think. Predators get displaced, young ones get separated. Sometimes—" He paused, watching the mother clean her cub with tireless patience. "Sometimes the smartest thing they can do is seek the safest ground available, even if it means trusting the last creature they should." Trust. The word settled deeply. They worked with calm efficiency after that, speaking in low tones, arranging transport, contacting rescue teams equipped for animals far larger than anything these mountains typically hold. Through it all, the panther never showed aggression, only a quiet vigilance as strangers moved carefully within her sight. When they finally prepared a sheltered carrier for her and the cub, she hesitated just long enough to look back toward the cabin, toward me. There are glances that pass between beings without needing interpretation. In hers I felt no ownership, no farewell shaped like human sentimentality, only recognition. Two survivors acknowledging the brief crossing of their paths. The elephant proved harder to guide, lingering near the porch until one officer coaxed it gently forward. Before it followed, it turned once more, trunk lifting into the cold morning air. I felt the touch brush lightly across my chest, and something in me, someplace long hardened by solitary years, shifted. By midday, the clearing had emptied. The tire tracks filled slowly with meltwater. The blankets lay folded near the door. Only the faint impressions in the snow remained, already softening beneath the strengthening sun. Spring would erase them soon enough, as it erases most things. But not everything. I stood there a long while after the vehicles disappeared into the trees, listening to the wilderness breathe again. All my life I had believed survival out here depended on distance. Keep far from the wild, respect its danger, never invite it across your threshold. Yet the truth that morning felt far simpler and far heavier. The wild had come to my door, not in anger, but in trust. And as I looked out over the brightening forest, one final thought settled quietly into my bones. For all the years I feared what lived beyond those trees, it was not the wilderness that tested my humanity. It was whether I would open the door when it knocked.